Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Forum 360 co-chair and space systems engineer at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, Kate Stambaugh.
All right, good morning and welcome to day 2 of the AIAA Space 2015 Forum. As people are coming in from the lobby, I have a few announcements before we get started. First, thank you for being here. More than 800 of your colleagues from across the US and around the world are here in Pasadena this week, and I hope you've gotten a chance to reconnect with colleagues and friends and meet some new people and expand your network as we all help each other shape the future of aerospace. So let me first take this opportunity to thank the sponsors of the AIAA Space 2015 Forum. You can see them on the stage behind me. Without their generous support, we wouldn't be able to bring you this forum, so thank you. We have a few housekeeping items. As you saw on the slides right before we started, and it'll be up again later, this year we're doing questions from the audience via the new Conference IO site at aiaa.cnf.io. So if you have questions, you can submit that to the site and vote for your favorite questions. And those watching on the live stream can also do that. And the URL and more information on the Conference IO is in the first or second page of your program. So if you need more information, check there. Second, all of our panelists and speaker bios are available on the AIAA Space 2015 Forum site under the Speakers tab. And then as soon as this panel is over, I'll have a few more announcements and reminders about the rest of the day. So please stick around to the end, and we'll go over just a look ahead of what's coming for the rest of the day. So the landscape of the space industry has changed a lot in the last 15 years with the dawn of privatized space ventures, a growth in robotic exploration missions, and the dawn of a new era of human exploration. Our morning's panel will help us consider the business of space. How is space business evolving to meet future needs? Please welcome the moderator of this morning's panel, Carissa Christensen. She's a managing partner of the Tauri Group, and she will begin the discussion on these important topics. So, Carissa.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Kate. I am delighted to be here. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank Sandy Magnus and the AIAA for the opportunity to moderate this panel, and also the organizing committee this year for the excellent and thoughtful content of this conference. And I'd also like to thank the panel sponsors. So our panel this morning is considering how the business of space has changed. And we're going to look at that over the last decade or so, and we're going to look at what that means for the future. And so we've got the ideal panel for that today, and I'm going to welcome them up here and give you a little bit of a sense of who they are and how they fit in. Then I'll set the context for our discussion with some data on how the industry has changed, and then we'll launch into a discussion with the panelists, and we very much want to have questions from the audience. We have the excellent electronic system, so please use it. So if I could invite the panelists up. And our panelists today include Phil McAlister from NASA. NASA is represented here. NASA's acquiring access to the ISS from commercial providers and is looking at ways to expand that model. And Phil at NASA is the Director of Commercial Spaceflight Development. He oversees the commercial crew and cargo programs. And Phil has a career-long history of working strategy issues and issues of space commerce. He was Executive Director of the Augustine Committee. He led NASA's efforts on the U.S. National Space Policy. He won NASA's Exceptional Service Award. Prior to joining NASA, Phil was at Futron, where I had the pleasure of working with him. He was at TRW, and he was at Answer. We are also going to hear from Boeing today. Boeing, of course, is a commercial crew provider and commercial satellite manufacturer, among its many other identities, part of the changing business of space. We're going to hear from Dr. Bruce Chesley. Bruce is the Chief Architect, Network and Space Systems of Boeing Defense and Space and Security. And his job is really well suited to this panel. His job is to align technology investment and development with the current and future needs of the business. He has responsibility for exploration, for cybersecurity, for missile defense, for satellite communication systems, and he has broad experience at Boeing. He was with Space and Intelligence, and he was also with Boeing Phantom Works. Before Boeing, he was an Air Force officer and also on the faculty of the U.S. Air Force Academy in the Department of Astronautics. We're also joined by United Launch Alliance, which has introduced Vulcan, a new vehicle concept using a commercial engine and targeting internationally competitive rates. And here with us from ULA is Dan Collins, the Chief Operating Officer for ULA. Dan runs the Atlas and the Delta expendable launch vehicle programs from design to launch. His background in launch is encompassing. Before he came to ULA, he worked on the Delta, the Titan, ELV, and Sea Launch programs for Boeing. He started his career at McDonnell Douglas, working on station, and he also worked for Northrop Corporation. Finally, we are going to hear from Planet Labs. Planet Labs is deploying a very large constellation of CubeSats, leading the wave of new satellite firms seeking to create new markets for imagery. And we're very fortunate to have today Robbie Schingler, a co-founder and president of Planet Labs. And Planet Labs really is one of the industry's emblems of change. And Robbie, in his leadership role there, has been instrumental in creating that opportunity and that business. Prior to Planet Labs, Robbie spent 9 years at NASA. He helped to formulate the Small Spacecraft Office at NASA Ames. He was the capture manager for the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite. He did a couple of tours at NASA headquarters, and there was NASA's open government representative to the White House and saw NASA win an award for open government, and also incubated the currently active Space Technology Mission Directorate with a portfolio of about $650 million. He was a Presidential Management Fellow. So I think that I hope that you will agree that we have an extraordinary panel today and are very well positioned to talk about the business of space and how it's changing. And so to set the context for that, let me talk a little bit about what the numbers look like. So the business of space today, how has it changed? Why are we having this conversation? And is this a real change? And I think that it is real, and I want to show you some data to make that point. So first of all, the business of space is more valuable than it was 15 years ago. Just a few examples. We've seen the emergence of massive markets for satellite television, nearly $100 billion, and GPS products around $75 billion, starting from a very low base. More recently, we've seen new investors attracted to space with announced angel and venture capital deals at maybe 1 or 2 a year at the beginning of the century, 15 years ago. And we're now seeing more than 60 a year in the last few years, and 2015 already has surpassed all previous years and is continuing to grow. The business of space also involves more players. In 2000, fewer than 40 countries hosted satellite operators. Now that number is nearing 70. The number of launches, payloads launched, has increased 2.5 times, and that's happened quite recently, and that's largely driven by the first massive deployment of CubeSats. So that number is kind of Robbie's fault. The number of space companies founded, I think this is extremely interesting. So these are companies founded and funded. Around 15 years ago, we would maybe see one company a year. And we now see something like one company a month. That's a distinctive difference. And the overall size of the industry has quadrupled in the last 15 years. And there are more commercial products and services. There's more to sell today. There's growing conventional satellite applications like mobile broadband, the planned very small satellite constellations that are offered imagery and weather and innovative comm. There's commercial space infrastructure, including commercial engines, commercial capsules, launch services, and platforms either in development or in operation. And that's at the core of the change of the business of space. And finally, the business of space has changed because there is more uncertainty. There's market risk in new service offerings like small sat imaging and weather, as well as conventional telecom applications because people are changing the way they use their phones and they watch TV. The volatile government budgets are disrupting business plans that seek to use commercial models to help NASA and the DoD meet their mission needs. New satellite form factors add another dimension of uncertainty to changing launch architectures and cost structures. Commercial human spaceflight is creating new expectations about safety and also is affecting the balance of leadership and vision within the space community and where that leadership and vision comes from. And all of those changes result in a transformation of the space industrial base, with new companies and players entering, traditional players changing, and sometimes leaving the market. So I think that it's definitively the case that this panel is addressing a real phenomenon. We've got the right panelists to address it. I hope you take the opportunity to ask questions, and I think it's going to be a very enjoyable hour and a half. Thank you. So to start our conversation, we'll hear briefly from each panelist and then take questions.
Thanks, Carissa. Thanks for everybody for showing up this early. So how is the business of space changing? I think we have our first example by the fact that the NASA headquarters person is the most casually dressed of everybody here at the panel. I mean, that's clearly a huge change, isn't it? And a change good change. So I would say things definitely are changing. It definitely feels different to me today than it did umpty-ump years ago when I started in the industry, and certainly different from the little boomlet we had in the early 2000s. So I was trying to reflect on what it is that is different. There's a lot of different things. There's more focus on the customer, I think, and the business plan. I think that's good, and maybe a little bit less so on technology. But one thing that I was struck when I was thinking about this was the amount of time we spend talking about innovation, thinking about innovation. And an aspect of that is what I'm going to talk about today. Is called reframing. Next slide. Reframing is a concept that, oh, should I press? I thought he was going to press. All right, thank you. Full service moderator. I stole this concept from a book called Ingenious by Tina Seelig. And the way she talks about this reframing is it's a very powerful concept. You can see the two questions that look arguably very, very similar. What's the sum of 5 plus 5 versus what two numbers add up to 10? Seemingly very similar numbers, similar questions, just differing in arithmetic, but the first one has only one correct answer. Whereas if you phrase the question the second way, you have infinite numbers of possible solutions, which this book argues really helps unlock innovation within your organization. We see that in a lot of different industries. Next slide. Particularly in photography. Photographers are constantly asking, should I use a wide-angle lens or a telephoto lens? Should I take this picture from 1 inch away versus 10 feet away? Those pictures and those perspectives, how you reframe, really change whether you have a nice but fairly commonplace picture on the left versus a very cool, very iconic picture on the right. And you see it in comedy too. The punchline of a joke usually changes the perspective or the frame of the question, and that's what makes it amusing. So I've got a clip from a Pink Panther movie.
Does your dig bad? No. Yes, dig it. I thought you said your dig did not bite.
That is not my talk.
So the last line obviously changes that. So what does that have to do with space? Not much. I just thought it was a funny clip. I'll get back on topic. Next slide gets me back. So reframing is I don't believe this is just a luxury. You're sort of talking about it like, oh, that'd be nice to have. I think this is really critically important for our space business going forward. Another example of this, and now it's more engineering, that's why I included this one. If you ask somebody, I don't read the whole thing, but if you ask somebody to build a bridge, we can build bridges. We know how to do that. But they're costly, and they take a long time, and they take a lot of labor. Instead, you ask why. The question, why do you want this bridge? And you say, well, I have to get across the river. Well, that opens up a whole new range of possibilities. There's a lot of ways to cross a river, some that are much more cost effective than building a bridge. And you can even take it further back and say, well, why do you want to cross that river? Well, the answer might be, I have a job over the river. That opens up even more possibilities, right? Because you could maybe get a job on this side of the river, then you don't need any transportation mode at all. Next slide. So we've seen, I could have tons of examples on here, but you see these successful reframers, the life cycle of a business generally has 3 phases, not always, but generally we call them the risk taker, caretaker, and then undertaker phase. And the successful businesses sort of reboot themselves back to the risk taker phase before they get to the undertaker phase. And you can see Amazon clearly just sold books. Now they sell just about everything. Netflix, really cool, used to just sell DVDs, and now they stream, and has spawned a whole cultural phenomena of binge watching, which is really good. I'm about halfway through House of Cards right now. And then you've got unsuccessful reframers. These are companies that were really successful, and those are the companies that are most at risk from falling into the undertaker mode, because success generally breeds a certain confidence in the way you are doing business currently, and that's what we have to avoid in the space business. Next and last slide. We really have to avoid assuming, and this is something I harp on at NASA all the time, assuming that the way we are doing it is the one right way. And now I'll get back to commercial crew. It's really, you think that NASA is helping these industry companies, and we certainly are, but NASA is definitely benefiting from this interaction as well. Seeing how each one of these companies come about these problems using different propulsion, different thermal protection systems, different just about everything. In the previous round, we had a space plane. Now we have a couple capsules. That has really, I think, invigorated NASA. I'll give you one other example, and then I'll get off the stage, to how even governments can incorporate this sort of reframing. It used to be in all of our traditional human spaceflight programs, we would just apply our workmanship standards, our safety standards. We have a bunch of these at NASA, and we would just apply them to the contract. Most companies these days, they have their own internal corporate standards, which in many cases are as good or better than the NASA standards. Previously, we didn't care. We knew our standards were good, we understood them, we said, just use our standards. And it can be very costly for the companies to redo their processes, maybe redo some of their documentation just to fit our standards. So with commercial crew, we are allowing alternate standards. So if the company can demonstrate that their standard is as good or even better than ours, they can use their standard. And again, that has been a good interaction for NASA to see how there are many different ways of coming at the same problem, and that really does unlock innovation. And I think that's one of the ways that business is different today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Thank you.
Excellent. And Bruce, would you like to?
Sure,
I'm happy to.
I'll see if I
I'm
can
happy to
check
be the
it.
permanent clicker.
Well, good morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Bruce Chesley from Boeing, our network and space business. Let's see if we can go back to the first slide here. Here we go. So our network and space business includes our human spaceflight activities that you see there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, our commercial and government satellite businesses, and also a missile defense business that's all about protecting the homeland. And you know, one of the things that Phil mentioned about how standards are changing and practices and procedures, you know, we're seeing a lot more cross-flow across these businesses than we had traditionally. So we're, you know, taking command and control software from the missile defense arena and bringing it into the satellite arena. We're taking mission assurance practices from space and applying them to missiles. We're, you know, our satellite factory is building the flight computer for the SLS rocket. So a much more dynamic shift across the business areas, and I think that really is a reflection of some of the changes that we've seen. As the space business has matured, it's not so much specialized technologies. We're seeing technologies that apply to multiple aspects of completing the missions. So thinking about the topic at hand here and how it relates to us in Boeing, it's really a large part of it comes down to the insatiable demand for bandwidth and mobility. And so I just thought we'd put a little illustration in here of, on the left here you see a traditional satellite design, And on the right is the more modern digital designs that we're introducing right now. And what the image below is the air traffic flying from Europe over to the continental US. So that's the North Atlantic air route that you're looking at. And there are other examples I could use, but you know, I'm Boeing, so we like airplanes. And what you see is the shift in traffic throughout the day. So early in the morning in Europe, you see more of the air traffic in Europe. And a lot of those airplanes are headed towards the US. And then as the sun shifts over and the business day starts in the US, you see much more air traffic over there. And if you look at the sort of undulating orange piece there, essentially what a satellite operator has to do with a traditional analog approach is to place their bets. They have to decide, hey, where am I going to put the big humps in bandwidth? And those remain static. And so you see times where the demand surges above the capacity of the satellites, and then you see times where there's capacity that's sitting there that's not used, like nighttime in Europe, that European capacity goes dormant. So if you're thinking of in-flight entertainment or connectivity in the airplane, you have some wasted capacity and you have some places where you're underserving your demand. On the right, with the digital design, you're able to move that capacity and bandwidth to where it's needed, when it's needed. And so that's what we're seeing more and more. We're being driven by the satellite operators to provide that flexibility in power, flexibility in bandwidth, flexibility in waveform, and so we're providing much more of that kind of capability within our system. And the airplane example is useful because it's a nice, daily kind of a thing. But there are other changes that happen, whether it's in cellular backhaul, whether it's in DARS, in direct audio radio systems, like Sirius XM, for example. There are changes that occur over days and weeks, but when these satellites are on station for 15 or 20 years, there are changes in markets that occur over time. I mean, just think back 15 years ago, who could have predicted what kind of demands we have now? And so the ability to have that kind of flexibility and prevent stranded capacity, as the satellite operators call it, enables them to have much more flexible business models going forward. So that's kind of, to me, a great example of where the business need and the technology are developing together to enable new capabilities for traditional geo type of operators. Another area, picking up on your comments, Phil, the NASA Commercial Crew Program is really kind of a really terrific example of creating a commercial market. It is a program for NASA, but in my mind, one of the key things that NASA did is it gave industry a sense of how big the market was. And so by committing to the market and by saying, hey, there's going to be X number of launches, then that helped us decide on a commercial basis, okay, how much investment do we want to put into it, and what technology development will we put into it, and really look at it as a true return on our investment in a commercial model. So there was never, just like any commercial satellite deal that we go after, we don't know if we're going to win, but we make a calculated effort to say, okay, we're probably going to win a certain amount of these, and we can take that market risk. And NASA enabling that market risk, I think, was really a really remarkable journey, and I think a really successful approach. And we're very proud of our legacy in human spaceflight, and we're really proud of the fact that we're the first ones that have been awarded a commercial commitment to bring astronauts to station. So that's terrific, and our commercial crew processing facility down at the Cape is having a ribbon cutting on Friday. So a lot of great progress there. And in a lot of ways, NASA is really leading the way in terms of thinking about these different models for bringing on board commercial providers. And I think we're starting to see some of that bleed over to other parts of government, namely the U.S. Air Force is taking some commercial-like approaches and allowing commercial standards on programs like wideband global SATCOM, for instance. So we're seeing governments are changing in response to the emerging markets as well. And then just a couple more quick examples of what's changing. The business deals are changing on satellites, looking at hosted payloads. So the satellite there on the left is Inmarsat 5. Flight number 3 just occurred on Friday morning. So that vehicle is on its way as the third satellite in the Inmarsat 5 constellation. And one thing I'll point out on that is there's a high capacity payload, those antennas you see there in the center body of the nadir deck there. And that high capacity payload is fully interoperable with the Air Force's wideband global SATCOM system. And so a military operator who has a WGS terminal could also have their traffic going over Inmarsat without having to change their user equipment. And so that's, again, kind of a blended approach. We're seeing much more of a blurring of the lines between what is traditionally government or traditionally commercial. We're seeing that shift. Another example of how things are changing is the dual stack 702 SP, our newest satellite design. It's all electric. And what all electric propulsion enables is allows us to reduce a tremendous amount of mass of carrying around all that chemical propellant. And so you can launch 2 satellites at a time. So from a satellite operator's point of view, the launch cost is cut in half. So that can be a tremendous advantage for commercial operators. And then we're also making big investments in smaller buses. Our 502 Phoenix bus line, as we call it, addresses some of these LEO imaging approaches, and we're working with a number of smaller firms more in the startup kind of a realm with that smaller, less expensive part of our product line. So, we see the blending of traditional and sort of new space kinds of missions, and we're seeing the market forces and the technologies lining up to make a really exciting time in the space industry. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Bruce. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being at the conference and get a chance to give the launch provider perspective on a very dynamic and changing business. So let's see if we can get some charts up here. Oh, okay. There we go. Carissa put up in the beginning a chart with about 5 question marks talking about really the dynamics in the industry. Lots of questions, probably more unknowns than there are equations, so this isn't a chance to just sit back and go back to the same old playbook and rerun it. We're having to think of things differently. But also in uncertainty, you try and look at what are the fundamentals. And in the launch business, really I think all of space, the first fundamental is mission success. People are paying you to get their asset on orbit. Certainly, whether you're talking about government budgets or a commercial business plan, they're looking for you to get it when they need it so that they can live within their budgets so that they can get their revenue. So that's certainly something we never want to forget. The other part about the launch business is it's infrastructure intensive. Launch pads are typically not cheap. And so when you look at how to be a successful launch business, certainly I look at trying to get as much throughput through as small an infrastructure as possible. And that's a fundamental that's guiding ULA as we look to serve our customers in a very dynamic market. So some examples of how we're trying to reduce. Certainly consolidating infrastructure is an important part of that. And that's what we're looking to do with Vulcan, is to be able to service many, many markets with a single launch vehicle with a minimum number of launch pads. Launch pads take people, they take maintenance, they typically drive cost into systems, so we're trying to reduce that. Another way that we're looking is to look and work with our partners much differently than we have in the past. A great example of that for ULA is our partnership with RUAG. We've recently announced that we're going to consolidate our composite structures manufacturing into one supplier with RUAG, and in fact, they are going to operate within our factory in Decatur, Alabama. So here we're going to take more of what we do, consolidate it into a single supplier, and then also consolidate that supplier into our footprint in a very modern rocket factory in Decatur. So this is all driving to that smaller, if you look at the equation or the ratio, the throughput over the infrastructure, trying to drive that infrastructure to be as small as and efficient as possible, dealing with very high quality suppliers like RUAG, people who are also building for other launch vehicle manufacturers as other manufacturers in space. This all drives that. Another part of what we're doing is working on the top part of that equation. Certainly many of you are aware we've had a pretty good run with the national security space business. That business, as you look to it, as new competitors are being introduced, the actual demand from that customer is shrinking significantly. So we're going to have a much smaller business base with a national security space customer, and they're going to split it amongst competitors. So we've needed to, several years ago, seeing this coming, start working very hard as in other sides of the business. Very, very proud to be launching Cygnus twice in the coming months, December and March. And those launches are actually twice the capacity of the other commercial cargo launches that have happened. So we're actually going to get basically 4 launches from here to next spring. Very, very important to the space station. But we've got a footprint in cargo. Very excited about the announcement coming later this year for CRS-2 and be able to expand more into cargo. And certainly can't let go without talking to Bruce, and very proud to be Bruce's supplier in launching the CST-100 and getting on top of an Atlas where, human spaceflight in this country started, back on top of an Atlas and getting people back to space station through American launches, American systems. So working the top part of that. Also our recent win of the EchoStar 19 commercial satellite, a big deal for us. Back into the commercial market, we've sold quite a, we are moving more deliberately into the true commercial providers, and we think there are things that we bring with our high reliability, certainly lower interest rates. But what all this is about is working both sides of that ratio, the top and the bottom, expanding the throughput, shrinking the infrastructure. That's what uncertain times demands, because as each of those question marks gets answered over time, if we are more efficient with our resources and we can provide a high reliability, lower cost launch, then we're going to have a very responsive product regardless of how those things get answered. So that's how we're attacking a pretty dynamic industry, trying to bring innovation. The last thing I want to talk on that is getting more launches through a single pad. And the MUOS launch, which is scheduled to go off tomorrow, we needed to wait a day or two while Erica decided which way she wanted to go and be ready to launch with the tropical storm late last week looking like it might come up the east coast of Florida. That's a unique launch in that we need to look at what do we have and how can we use it to serve the customer better. We had a span time to launch a Atlas rocket, which was serial. Got the booster up, then you started stacking about 5 or 6 pieces of the upper stage, inner stage, and the fairing. And what we were able to do is some bright people looked around and said, hey, we've got this Delta facility, which was actually built by the NRO years ago to process Centaur upper stages, and said, gee, could we go do all of that serial stuff in parallel over in the Delta system? So for the first time on this MUOS launch, we took 7 days out of the span time of an Atlas 5-meter launch by doing much of the work off of our vertical integration facility over in a Delta facility, and then carted the whole thing down the road in one piece. What that does is if you're launching 10 times a year, essentially 36-day centers, and now you can go take 7 days out of each of those 10, that's 70 days. You're basically creating the opportunity to launch twice, 2 more times in the same year. So again, increasing the throughput, and this is just bright people looking around saying, my customer's got a problem, they need more from me for less, what do I have that can serve it? And that's what folks are doing, and I think they're doing an outstanding job. So next, just a couple of, that's me. Where are we going? Well, I think everybody, hopefully you're aware that we're going to build a new booster, the Vulcan, basically using a lot of what we've learned over the years, bringing a great engine to it with the BE4, and that's really step one. We need to be on an American propulsion system, and we're moving out aggressively with Blue Origin to make that happen. That's going to essentially let us do all of what Atlas does and what Delta does on a single stick, and do it on a single rocket through a single set of launch pads. Again, shrinking the infrastructure. Maintain the Delta IV Heavy as long as our customers need that, and we see that well into the next decade. Then we'll go focus on the upper stage and bring capability as we look at missions evolving in space and architectures evolving in space, with ACES being able to do much, much more on a single mission than anybody can today. We think we can do more than anybody else, and we want to maintain that lead and get every launch customer more for what they're paying. And then finally but the next step would be looking at reuse out in the next decade. Our smart reuse system brings the engines back. That's the huge part of a booster cost, is bringing the engine back, and you can do that with technology that's been around for quite a while at a much, much less of a hit to performance than what we would do to try and fly a whole booster back. And then looking way out into the future, very modular engine or rocket designs that could really support whether you want a very, very large single payload or a much more distributed architecture to put pieces up, join them in orbit, and then move out from Earth's gravity well from there. So we'll keep on changing. We've, every time this business has changed, whether it was just initiating launch services back in the 50s with Atlas and something called Thor that developed into Delta, to responding to the Challenger tragedy back in the 80s, to bringing forward the EELV solutions that were required in the 90s, to creating ULA. The folks at Atlas and Delta and now Vulcan have responded to the change every step of the way and been very successful in doing it, and we're looking forward to however those question marks are answered, we're looking forward to the being part of the solution. So with that, we'll pass it along.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning. My name is Robbie Schingler. I'm here with Planet Labs. Carissa, thanks for the invitation to speak with you guys today. I think there's a lot that's changing in our industry. I come and identify with the space sector, but I think there are 2 core things that are really happening, and it is that we do in space every day that we think about, which is access to space, and it's also what we do once we're in space. And there are a couple of trends that I saw during my time at NASA that I really wanted to bring together. And that is the access to space with secondary payloads, so that your total cost of a mission can go down tremendously. Then next is the actual ability to build a sensor system that is very capable very quickly, and to learn from that. And so I left NASA with 2 of my very good friends to start Planet Labs. And over the last 4 years, we've launched 101 satellites into space. We've had 11 attempts at launches, 2 of which, unfortunately, we've been unlucky on, and they did not make it to orbit. But still, 101 satellites that we've launched into space over the last 2 years. And but we're a completely venture capital funded company, and we're focused on trying to serve our customers. So one key thing that I do want to mention here and start off the presentation to tell you a little bit more about Planet Labs is the fact that we're actually not selling space stuff. We're selling things that are derived from space. So at Planet, what we do is we help users, many customers, detect and act on change. And we do that by imaging the entire land area of the Earth every day. The challenges today in the commercial remote sensing system, or just about anyone that operates in the global marketplace, either in agriculture or in finance or governments or nonprofits, NGOs, is that people don't have access to timely information. Very limited coverage of information that they can get, low revisit rates or slow access, and also very expensive. And the traditional approach in aerospace is to have very capable spacecraft that take pictures of high-value assets for singles of customers. And as a result of that, it's weeks until you gain access to information. If you're on the civil side of things, you have to task a system and wait in the queue, and you get relatively low coverage, and it's inexpensive. So recognizing the fact that we had a hypothesis that we can build a state-of-the-art spacecraft and mass manufacture them, we wanted to do a monitoring mission, which was to attack each one of these pain points that we saw that people have in the market. And that is to create a monitoring mission instead of a tasking mission, and image everywhere, regardless of if there's a customer there today, and make that information available. So global coverage, fresh data, and easy access. Over the last 4 years, we've built this end-to-end system, the ability to launch, operate, manage constellations of dozens of spacecraft autonomously. We have a couple dozen ground stations globally in order to operate these constellation of imaging spacecraft. Then we process all of the data and expose it to the web for our customers. And so what I wanted to highlight about this panel is the fact that we saw early on that the value in the market was in the data and the information feeds rather than in the spacecraft. But it was impossible to make that possible without the space segment. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've done inside aerospace, but the way in which we communicate into the market is really around the data and the information, and having dozens and hundreds and thousands and hopefully millions of customers rather than singles of customers. So internally what we did, as I mentioned before, we've launched 101 spacecraft. Each spacecraft have lessons learned from previous ones that we've launched, and we've iterated very quickly. We've used a secondary payload opportunity to get into space, and so constrained ourselves to the 3U form factor. And it turns out that there's a lot of capacity that we have in our phones, in our pockets, and we could actually use the similar types of systems to put that into space. So we've gone through 13 build iterations of our spacecraft over the last 3 years. We've learned how to mass manufacture them. We've got a global ground station network. We're very proud of our partnerships with NASA via NanoRacks for the ability to get into space very quickly and deploy the latest technology that we have in order to learn how to operate them in an autonomous way. In this video here, this was actually taken about 6 weeks ago from some astronauts on board the space station of the latest deployments of 14 spacecraft. This build is actually build 12. We have 14 more going up on the next Cygnus, actually. And actually, let me correct myself, we have 28 going up on that, 14 that just went up on the H-2B, and those will be deployed in the next couple of weeks. The ones that will be deployed in the next couple of weeks is our mass manufacturing spacecraft for next year. So we are ready for commercial operations. The space station orbit is excellent to get into space quickly and iterate, but it isn't the best orbit for an imaging mission. You want consistent shadow angles. You want to be in space for 3 to 5 years rather than 6 to 9 months. But with that, I look forward to the discussions, and very glad to be here.
Well, thank you all panelists. Very interesting setups, and thank you audience. We have a number of excellent questions and a lot of engagement. The top 4 questions basically address 2 topics, so I'm going to combine them because there's a lot of interest. And so the question is the role of government and the role of industry, the role of in this new era of space business. And there's a particular concern that was raised that's quite interesting. So the idea is, as government agencies try to achieve their mission goals more inexpensively or efficiently by privatizing or relying on commercial space, there's a risk, according to this question, that the government agency loses that capability. So NASA becomes a procurement agency and the nation doesn't have access to space expertise. So can you address that broad question of the role of government in the era of space business and that specific question of national expertise and how that plays in? And Phil, you're the obvious place to start.
That's why I want to go last.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
First. I can go first. So I think that the government plays a very important, obviously, important role in space, not only in civil and in military intelligence, but also for commercial space. And it's not just to be a good customer, but it also is to set the right consistent policies and regulate in a predictable way. I think from the perspective of Washington and thinking about the aerospace sector, we want to encourage entrepreneurial capabilities in aerospace, but then more than that, we want to have a really strong commercial aerospace sector that can innovate quickly and that can actually drive new business models and new economic opportunities. And from the perspective of Washington, they want that to happen inside the United States. And so there is a bit of a tension and a challenge and a shift as commercial space becomes stronger and stronger without the reliance of the government as a customer. But make no mistake that the role of government needs to be strong and have a long-term view for regulations and also learning how to be a good customer of commercial products.
Yeah, I think if you look at the history of technology, the government ends up being a leader in a lot of technologies. Think about computing, for instance. The early computers were, government funded, largely for government use. And as the technology matured and became more of a mass market kind of a capability, the government shifted their focus into other technologies and other investments. And I think, I think we're starting, you can argue that in telecommunications, you can argue that in computing, and I think we're starting to see that in space. And so I do think there's a risk there, as the question points out, that government could just kind of lose that technology leadership. But I think it's really more of a choice. And where does the government focus their limited resources in terms of technology development? And so, as a great example is wideband satellite communications. As that becomes a mature, as high throughput satellites that are being developed on a commercial basis are surpassing some of the capabilities of government wideband systems. That's starting to see that tipping point where maybe the government can rely on the commercial market, a healthy commercial market, to sustain that technology base, and they can focus on things that are of particular national need.
So I want to thank Robbie and Bruce for giving me enough time to think about my answer. I would say my time in the government has really highlighted for me that almost everything is a risk versus risk trade. So yes, there's some risk associated with relying on a commercial service, but there's also risk the other way. I mean, we relied on the space shuttle, not a commercial service, and that was retired in 2011. We did not have a capability for U.S. human access to space after that. So relying on a fully government market-driven capability did not result in zero risk, and we ended up without that capability. So I don't see these things as binary, right? I generally see them as risk versus risk trade. So when we went into commercial crew, we obviously recognized that there was a risk there, and there was a number of strategies that we used to mitigate that risk. The first one was make sure that we had healthy competition. We did not want this to be something that only one company or maybe one or two companies could perform. And so in the very early rounds of Commercial Crew CCDEV2, we got 8 very good proposals. I remember we had many more proposals, but 8 went through due diligence, all of which we were convinced could probably have worked at some point in the future. So ensuring we had competition, ensuring that we were relying on capable companies as our partners, technologically capable as well as financially capable. And then finally, redundancy. We have 2 companies in the Commercial Crew program. We have 2 cargo providers as well, and that has mitigated that risk significantly, I think. So everything requires a unique solution, so I'm not saying that works everywhere. You do have to look at what you're trying to procure, when you need it, and what your backup plan is. But again, I would really emphasize that almost all of these are definitely risk versus risk trades.
I just quickly agree with Phil. It's much bigger risk to try and continue to think we're in the 1980s. We've got one, from a national security space, we're one of 2 superpowers. We're just going to keep our eye there. The world's very different today. Even in that market, it's different in the commercial market and the civil markets. Everything is changing rapidly. So staying stagnant, putting our head in the sand and thinking that change is for everybody else and we're going to keep doing it the way we always have is the biggest risk. So we're going to have to move. The question is going to be what roles, and this is for the government to decide, what role do they want to play, what role do they want industry to play, and we will adjust to the decisions that they make and serve in our roles to the best of our ability.
And I also think that a note there, kind of a historical note, is at this moment in time, there's an enormous amount of pull by commercial interests as opposed to push by government interests to try to reduce costs through commercialization. This is Planet Labs is not in business because someone in the government said, gosh, how can we reduce our costs? So it's a very different dynamic than what we might have seen 10 or 15 years ago.
Yep.
So the next question is 2 questions on quite related topics. The broader version of the question is, what is your vision of space business beyond Earth orbit? And then the specific question, which is an homage, Phil, to your reframing of the conversation. Why do we want to go to Mars? How does reframing this question change the perspective of space business, which is lots of fun. So the general question, what's beyond, for space business, what's beyond Earth orbit? And the specific question about reframing the why do we want to go to Mars. Do you want to start with the what's beyond Earth orbit, Robbie? Do you have visions of that?
Sure.
I know Planet Labs must have visions of that.
Well, just to be clear, we're absolutely focused on Earth as our planet for now. But I think that the capability that industry is creating, not only in sensors but then also in access to space, will allow for there to be a lot of activity. I think that the government is going to continue to lead the way beyond Earth orbit for science and exploration purposes. And along the way, I think intelligent industrial capability will be created to where the market is today, which is around Earth commerce, obviously, that then can feed forward into infrastructure moving forward. So the types of infrastructure that I think can be commercially viable is for the types of infrastructure that we have in space today around Earth, right? So that is remote sensing, telecommunications, position, navigation, timing, that type of infrastructure we're going to need as we actually become multiplanetary. And in addition to that, it can get to a point of a lot of the things that have been pioneered under Commercial Crew, the opportunity for there to be innovative incentives and business models and intelligent procurement mechanisms that create the type of industrial base for there to become more markets that are actually out there.
So Planet Labs, imaging Mars, you heard it here first.
Sure. Okay, I'll jump in, sure. Yeah, certainly. I think there's a lot of opportunities to continue to commercialize low Earth orbit, including human habitation in low Earth orbit and so on. And I just see, and I agree with Robbie that we'll continue to see government pave the way in terms of exploration and infrastructure, and but that will open up some really exciting opportunities for. Whether it's resources or whether it's further activities on the moon or asteroid kinds of activities, and then ultimately Mars. And I think what's exciting is a lot of the building blocks are being put in place already. So if you think of an incremental approach, the things that are happening on station, the things that are happening with SLS, and having a rocket capability to get beyond Earth orbit, and then a number of the technologies, electric propulsion and things like that for enabling deep space exploration. So I think the building blocks are there, and then I think that creative entrepreneurs and business opportunities will emerge from that.
We don't deliver from space; we deliver to space. That's our role. And so as we look out, how do we enable our customers, who are the people who are going to go beyond and do that? And if, certainly don't want to go back to more charts, but the right-hand side of that evolution was about enabling different architectures. Certainly our next step, and we're excited to be a part of SLS. We're building the initial upper stage for the SLS, but beyond that is the big rocket with a single launch to get a lot of stuff into space, the right architecture to go beyond Earth. Are there others to where we can do what we've already done with Space Station and assemble something in low Earth orbit that can then bring value and deliver from space? And so trying to have an architecture that will enable as many for launch, that'll enable as many approaches as possible to be vetted, to be competed, and so that we get the right answer to move beyond. That's really where our focus is, where we're looking at ACES and as an upper stage that is much more capable and can enable things that are just different than how we've always thought about it. The Apollo architecture was an amazingly successful one, but again, it's not the only one. Yeah, it's how we've done it before, but is that necessarily the right answer for what we're going to want to do out in the 2030s? And I'm sure people have different timelines, and I probably just offended somebody. But how can we enable as many ideas as possible?
So when I think about beyond low Earth orbit, I guess I'm more of an incrementalist. I'm very much, obviously, an advocate for commercial, but when I think about what we're doing beyond low Earth orbit, I'm not sure that let's just say the ingredients that we needed to have in place for commercial crew for us to go forward with commercial crew, there were a couple really key features. One was that the government was not the only customer. I mean, you could see from the space tourism industry, from other astronauts that NASA had flown into space on the shuttle, there was demand, significant non-government demand for traveling to low Earth orbit for people, for a variety of reasons. So that was one key ingredient. The second key ingredient was we weren't pushing the state-of-the-art technologically. I mean, it's hard. Human spaceflight is one of the hardest things we do as a nation, as a people, but it is not something where we were pushing TRL levels from a 3 to a 7 or a 7 to a 10. We had taken humans to low Earth orbit over 100 times successfully, and so we felt like those two things were really important for us to have in place before we moved down in commercial crew. I don't think you have either one of those for beyond low Earth orbit. I think for the near term, and I'm not going to put any timelines on that, but for today and for the near term future, I really only see governments as the customer, probably NASA, for a strong beyond low Earth orbit activity. And we really have some things that we have to learn and some state-of-the-art that we have to push before we can really do that in a more commercial fashion. So I kind of see that in the near term as more of a traditional architecture. That doesn't mean to say somebody might not come up with a really good business plan, but I think we really need to focus on LEO. commercial crew, let me tell you, I have not planted the flag. There's no check on the success box yet. We are right in the middle of that development, and it's really, really hard. And cargo is really, is probably nice and potted, and I think we can claim success there. But we're right in the middle of commercial crew. We have to get that successful, then maybe the next step with LEO, and then maybe more, and then very, very much incrementally, so that we don't go backwards, right? And we don't have a gap in that capability. So that's what I would say. In terms of the second part of the question was reframing Mars, really good question. Honestly, I'm not sure we have the right frame for that today. We've tried a number of different frames. We've tried the telephoto lens, and we've tried the monochrome picture. I'm not sure we've actually got the right frame to get over that hump, to get a lot of people on board with that mission just yet. We continue to try and communicate why we're doing it, how we're doing it, but I think we still have some work to do there. And so if somebody in the audience can come up with a really good frame, we would be all ears, I can tell you.
Let's do a few directed questions so we can kind of move through the list, because there's some really interesting ones. We'll start with a very specific one for Boeing. When will you announce the first crew contract for a non-NASA customer? What's your sense of that market?
Wow, that's a great question.
It is.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the sooner the better. I don't have a firm answer for that, but we would love to do that. Obviously we're in the middle of a very difficult development, and so and as we've seen with a number of our products, typically after a first successful mission is when you start to get a sense for that additional demand.
Robbie, this is a question from someone who clearly lived through the pain of the 90s satellite boom and bust, late 90s, early 2000s, during the dot-com era, darken the skies with satellites era. Clearly that many ventures were proposed that failed. What is different now? Why will commercial satellite large LEO constellations, why will they work now when they didn't then?
Well, I think that it's still to be proven, and there are now resurgence of a number of low Earth orbit low Earth orbit telecommunication constellations that are out there. It does serve a different need, though. We do have a lot more people. There's a lot more penetration of people who have the need for bandwidth and access to information. So whether that is telecom or actually timely situational knowledge around where they are. So there are new markets that weren't there before. And I think that the infrastructure that was put in place in the 90s was really was extremely capital intensive. And I think that it's about an order of magnitude cheaper, if not more, now. And that allows for there to be different types of business models, different market entry opportunities, both for remote sensing as well as for telecommunications. But it's still to be proven, I think, is really the real answer. I think that there's, you have to take a look at the lessons learned from that. So for instance, fiber won out in the telecom. So for imaging, is that going to be drones and aerial photography winning out over satellite photography? We'll see. But from what we've heard from the market, from what we are transacting in today, I do think that that hopefully there will be a definitive success story over the next 12 months, at least in remote sensing.
Dan, this is a general question, but I think you are at the pointy end of the spear on this at ULA. How does the space business deal with political risks?
Well, I think I've already talked about that, is to focus on the fundamentals is certainly a part of that. If we want to specifically talk RD-180, so fundamentally, let's get a very high reliability, low cost, as low as we can drive the cost product, and it's going to find a market. And some of those markets will not be as affected by political risk. So I think there's a diversity of your your customer base is a way to do that and certainly help. But you know, we've always known that the you know, the RD-180 political risk was out there. We've certainly had plans in place that could deal with that and buy us some time. It's bought us some, and the reality is we need to work with our representatives in Washington to make sure that, you know, we follow the first rule of wing walking, which is don't let go of the strut you're holding on to before you've got your hand on the next one. We're working very hard to reach and get our hands on the next one, but there is a part of this that brings an immediate reality that, okay, the situation isn't what we had planned for the risk. We had ways to mitigate it. We're doing a lot of that, and we need to work with our representatives to make sure that the whole story closes and we can continue to offer what's been an amazingly successful service to the national security space customer.
That's a very uncynical answer to say, basically the answer is be aware of the risk, plan for the risk, and do the right thing and try to develop develop the best product you can, and that's the smartest solution.
And no matter what risks you plan for, the one that shows up is going to be slightly different than the one you planned for. And that's when it's important to have dialogue and figure out how to approach it and how to address it when it does materialize. And I think everybody's doing a very good job of working through a complex situation right now. And so.
Phil, a general and a specific, so what should the COTS commercial crew model be applied to next at NASA? And a very specific, and a suggestion perhaps, do you think the commercial model could be used for crew and cargo, could be applied to cislunar habitation modules? So we've got a significant contingent of folks who are looking for that opportunity.
Right. So remember the conversation we had before, which I said, don't give me any direct questions? Clearly, I want my $20 back. All right?
Well, if we're going to go down this path.
No, that's not true. Carissa would have charged me way more than $20 to do that. So, you know, that's funny. I've been getting that question. I think the day after we announced commercial crew, I got that question for the first time, like, what's next? What's next? And so part of my answer goes back to the previous answer, which is, man, I'm really focused on crew right now. We have to prove that we can do that successfully. I think we're well on our way. Our partners are really doing excellent work, and I think we've set the architecture so that they can succeed. But we've got to get crew there. Once we have crew, or maybe even before we're done, I think the business model could be applied to other mission capabilities. I'm not going to announce anything today, obviously, but we certainly have been looking at NASA through this LEO commercialization initiative. We held a workshop in December of last year, and we've had a number of following discussions about that with industry. About what are we going to do once the ISS, once the ISS is done. What's going to be the follow-on activity? We at NASA do not intend on building another ISS or another predominantly government-run station. So somewhere in there is some sweet spot through a station or a HAB module or something along those lines. I think there's definitely some mixture of commercial interest and government interest so that you could make the case for the next thing. So that's just one example. I think there are a couple others that are interesting. You do need those two ingredients. You do need other customers, and you do need something where you're not pushing the state of the art technologically, and something that I think the government can and is willing to be an anchor tenant for. I think that really does mitigate the risk. Bruce put that very well and very succinctly, that really does, for new space ventures, that is a significant risk reducer by saying that there is some government demand, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can see what it is, and I think it's incumbent on NASA to articulate what those are, and we're going through the process of defining what that is.
What's your view on space debris, the risk of space debris, the consequences of small sat systems, the impact to companies, what's being done? It comes up in every conversation about space right now. It comes up in every conversation about small satellite ventures. So kind of what's your headline on where we're at and what needs to happen?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's a huge problem. You know, we're seeing a lot more cooperation and data sharing, you know, through industry associations and partnership with government and industry to help avoid collisions. We have a part of our operation that manages the Iridium constellation, and you know, the number of collision avoidance maneuvers that they do every single month is staggering. And so, you know, I think you know, the current state of the orbital debris problem is that everybody's doing everything they can to avoid a catastrophic event. And you know, I think if we see some more catastrophic events happening, you know, I think that would be, you know, maybe an impetus for some significant funding there. It really is. It really comes back to you know, a risk-benefit kind of a thing. And right now, the avoidance approach is mitigating the risk. And so, you know, until that dynamic changes, I think that's probably, you know, I don't see a tremendous pull of investment or, you know, new technology or new, you know, any sort of debris reduction, you know, eliminate debris kinds of things. There's concepts that have been studied for years, but you don't really see any significant funding going into them yet. That's my take.
You know, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the Space Data Association does a really good job in allowing spacecraft operators to share where all the satellites are and to a high accuracy, to allow for there to be propagations for potential conjunctions. But existing debris as well is not just, you know, active satellites is a major concern and issue. And we are getting into the Kessler syndrome, especially between 800 and 1,200 kilometers in the sun synchronous orbit. That's where a lot of activity are. That's where a lot of spent upper stages are and dead satellites. And so it is a concern. It is a concern for the Commons. That is a concern that the entire space leadership globally need to think about how to do this. So I think we need better tracking of identification of where these are, so a little bit more of an open space situational awareness for the entire global community in order to see where debris are and what the risks really are. I think that we do need better propagation and models for potential conjunctions. There are a lot of alerts that are false positives that really aren't a danger. I think that and also for new entrants that are coming in that don't have high ISP or active propulsion, they should be very responsible about where they put their objects. There is customary law, at least in the United States, for 25 years that you must deorbit your spacecraft. And so that's something that we are very mindful of on how we, at Planet, around what we do in space. And so our ideal orbit is under 500 kilometers, where it lasts less than 5 years. So it flies beneath the space debris so we don't get hit by it, but then it also means that the satellites that we put in space don't really contribute toward that problem. There are also novel ideas out there for nudging debris out of the way using photon pressure from ground-based lasers. It actually is a really, really good physics solution in a non-destructive way, and something that people should look at for people being governments for doing orbital debris mitigation. But I think open SSA, I think responsible spacecraft operators, better propagation models, and looking at novel mitigation techniques are what the global community needs.
Well, first, I think in the last couple of years, we have deorbited more upper stages than we had ever done in our history. I know we've brought Atlas, our Centaurs back and deorbited in several of the Delta cryogenic upper stages. And so the first step is kind of from the medical industry, don't make the situation worse wherever we can. The other part is to have launch systems that are capable of not creating more. And as we're looking at Vulcan, certainly having the ability to have enough capability that we can get the customer's payload where it needs to go, then we get ourselves out of the way so we're not a problem. And then as we continue to evolve and create a more capable upper stage, are there applications for that upper stage once it has performed its primary mission of delivering the customer's asset to space, can we then spend some time cleaning up the neighborhood before we leave? And so those are all things that as we are investing in technology and innovation, that we have our eye on is to, it's where we make our living. It's where we love to come to work and is in space. Let's not dirty the thing up and make it any harder.
There's clearly support for that vision. Back to the specific questions, Robbie, one for you. How is imaging data typically used by your customers? And I'll expand on that a little bit and say, what is that? Who are those customers? What is that looking like?
Yeah, so we are happy to have a couple of dozen awesome customers at the moment that are getting access to the imagery that we have coming down from the spacecraft and eagerly are awaiting the operational imagery next year. So Q1, Q2 next year, we have a couple of launches that will allow for us to have the sensors in space to get to our daily product, which should have general availability toward the latter half of next year. But our customers, we're seeing a lot of interest in agriculture. At 3 meters per pixel, that is perfect for understanding how healthy one's crops are, and at that cadence, right? Because we also have near infrared in it, which allows for you to see chlorophyll content, so how healthy crops are. But at that cadence, it allows for farmers and growers to actually make better decisions if there's a crop infestation happening in a certain region or more fertilizer needs to be deployed. So this is part of something in the agriculture industry that is a precision ag, using data and information to make better decisions on more of a daily basis. We're also seeing a lot of interest from countries that don't have access to information. So a lot of emerging economies that really, the latest aerial photography that they had was in World War II, right? And so that is something that is that at our price point and our value proposition, we're serving an underserved customer. And so we are in a number of different countries. And we also announced about 6 months ago that we're acquiring a company called Blackbridge, which operates the Rapid Eye satellites. And for many reasons, they're an unbelievable team, but one of which is that they serve over 100 different countries. So they have a really good sales distribution model for the pixels that they gather, which is at 6.5 meters per pixel, which is very similar to ours at 3 to 5 meters per pixel, so that we could actually modify those contracts and increase that. So, and they have a lot of traction in the energy sector, in disaster response, and in national base maps.
Excellent. So the top question on the list is an interesting one. It says, so there are new technologies and system concepts like reusable launch vehicles that offer the promise of significantly reduced costs over the long term, but are challenged by large upfront development costs. And the question is, how do we get past that hump and get to these benefits? And I'm gonna shade that a little bit. I think that idea of we put in a lot of money now and we save a lot of money later is an article of faith in the space industry, and we have all seen 1,000 PowerPoint slides showing that if we only spend, X billion now, we will get many, many benefits. We're seeing a lot of companies start up now, and their model, as Robbie was saying earlier, is the costs are so much reduced compared to traditional, conventional space systems that they've been funded by a much larger and diverse group of investors. So it's really changed the art of the possible in that the door has opened for many of those ventures because they started small. So I'm curious about what each of you thinks about that model of where should we be investing now and it will really make a difference over the long term, and where that model just doesn't apply. So anyone who'd like to start on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Carissa. That's one of the age-old problems with the space business is, it's a capital-intensive business.
All we need is $5 billion.
Yeah, that's right. It's a capital-intensive business, and it takes a long time, typically, to deploy assets, in a traditional sense. And so, I think the exciting thing is seeing ventures like Planet Labs, where getting that time from launched, from company launch to first revenue, and seeing that happen on a much more rapid basis, it just puts a lot of pressure on the rest of the enterprise to be able to accommodate that. Affordable launch is certainly a key element, but a spacecraft design and manufacture has to be faster as well, and so I think that's the right way to think about it. Is the current state of the industry requires that upfront kind of investment and that sort of return on investment kind of thinking, but all the pressures that we're seeing are to how can we pull those things back to the left, reduce the capital expense, and start generating revenue much faster.
I think, from a business model, it's not just how much money, it's how quickly it gets paid back. So yeah, you're asking for billions, and in 13 years I'll give it back to you. That certainly doesn't work anymore. You look at Robbie's model where he's iterating very, very quickly. So yes, there's a lower investment. There's also a quicker time to test, and the cycle time is speeding up. And I think we have to figure out how in the launch business we are going to enable that quicker cycle time, because there's both time and money play into that business equation. And I think if all we focus on is the money, we're going to miss a very important factor in that time. How can we get somebody who has an idea on contract and launched and either generating revenue or learning from their experiment much faster than we have in the past? And it's not just building the hardware and launching it, it's the whole contracting system that's out there, and there are ways to innovate other than with hardware, and I think people have to be looking at those ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think humans are very, very hard to innovate on, getting humans into space very quickly. Same thing for getting anything into space very quickly, and so we kind of chose the easy path on the robots, and to actually iterate that really quickly. But I think you're totally right, that speed and learning, and to do the end-to-end system to really understand where to invest, which has the non-linear value that you actually get as the enterprise, is the right thing to do. And it's hard to get it if it takes you 3-4 years in order to get the first thing going. So how quickly you can actually get the end-to-end system to know where to invest is the right thing to do, and to also prove something to your users, your customers, your regulators, that the vision that you're going after is achievable. And every quarter that you speak with them, you make substantial progress. So I think that helps as well. For us, it's not only speed, but it is cost. We started with $200,000, and we spent that over a year, and then $3 million, and we spent that over a year. And now we've raised over $200 million. But if we first went and said, hey, we're going to image the whole world every day, give us $200 million, they'd be like, who are you? So by iterating really quickly, choosing the value proposition and what your hypothesis is and what you're going and how you're going to validate that, and then learning from that and then going to the next step, I think is the right way to build these capabilities.
And if I could just it isn't time or money. It's time and money.
Yeah,
It's cost is a big player for everybody.
So we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask sort of a headline last question. Each of your organizations is clearly responding to the changing business of space and responding to it very actively. So I asked for sort of the headline answer on what about that change has been the hardest and what has worked best for your organization as you've adapted and changed to the evolving business of space. I'll let anyone jump in first.
Well, I think the hardest is to take what I believe is the greatest rocket team in the world, who has had a huge amount of success for decades, and help us to react to a very changing dynamic environment. Success breeds a comfort with how you do things, and the world's changing. And so certainly I think that has been a part that has been and will continue to be something that the leadership at ULA really has to focus on, and to help people feel comfortable in change. I think the part that I'll just go to that's worked very well is I talked about RUAG, and there's several other suppliers who are very like-minded to ULA, and we're starting to approach it much more as a team, and in looking at this equation of throughput through the infrastructure, working that through a much broader enterprise brings so many more opportunities. And I'm very, very proud of what we've done with RUAG and with some others that we'll be announcing in the future. So those would be my two responses.
Thank you.
I think one of the hardest things is, space is still hard. It's hard to get there. It's a harsh environment. So that part is, and that can be constraining, and it is. It's to innovate within that model after you've learned all the hard knocks over 50 years of here's all the things that can go wrong in space. So trying to break out of that mold is really the hardest thing. But in some ways, that's the best thing too. That is the really exciting thing when we've got opportunities to innovate, both in terms of technology, in terms of business model, and there's opportunities for incremental kinds of innovations and revolutionary innovations. And so having all of that variety available to us, I think, is really the best part about it, and really is, I think it's exciting for our workforce, and it's I think we're able to bring some exciting things to our customers on both the commercial side and the government side.
Yeah, very similar comments. The hardest thing has been, I think, incorporating the changes into a big, successful, arguably successful organization like NASA. The culture change aspect, I feel, has been the most difficult. We've made some inroads. I kind of feel like it's a fairly superficial layer. Not sure if it's really taken hold within the organization, but to get NASA to look at new things, new ways of doing business, we've been doing better on that. But I think that has been one of the biggest challenges to date. I don't mean to say or imply that NASA isn't open to those things, but it definitely has been a challenge. Getting commercial crew, the thing that we hear that I continue to run up against is honestly, why don't you just do it the old way? On so many different aspects of commercial crew, not just the procurement mechanism, but how we deal with our requirements, how we deal with just about everything associated with human spaceflight. I just heard again and again and again, why don't you do it the same way? And that's a really difficult challenge to overcome. But I think we're making progress. So that's the good part.
I was going to say.
I think one of the challenges that I thought early on would be the regulatory environment, and because putting up hundreds of spacecraft as a startup, that was something that haven't been regulated before by commercial remote sensing. And I think over the years, though, and I think part of it was bringing them along in the story and actually proving capability, each quarter along the way. We've had great relationships with the regulators. So the largest kind of challenge inside the aerospace portion of what we're doing is still launch. Absolutely, without a doubt. You have to book something that's 2.5 years into the future, and you have to say exactly what your payload is and your mass concentrations and your interface and so forth. And it's and I get it. That's the way that it works. That is a challenge. I think we're encouraged by the now satellite launchers, both small all the way up to mid-class. So I think that is going to help a lot with that responsiveness. And then last, still in the space side of things, is especially being from the aerospace sector, it's the greatest challenge is to focus on actually building a commercial business instead of doing more things in space. And so that's been a challenge to communicate to so many of our colleagues within the government and other aerospace sectors for why we're not collaborating on other things as well, is to keep that singular focus for building our own economic engine, which then allows for us to do other things in the future. But launch is still a very difficult business and a pain point from getting access to space really quickly, like on the order of months.
With that, we will end our panel. I would like to thank the panelists who have, for joining us today, who've just been marvelous, and if you'll join me in thanking them. Thank you very much. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the AIAA for setting up the electronic question system, and thank you as an audience. These were marvelous questions. There was a lot of interaction. The panelists are here to speak to topics that you find interesting. This is so incredibly satisfying to be able to address questions directly. So thank you for your participation, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
All right, thank you, Carissa. We have a few announcements. Thank you, panelists, for that really engaging discussion. The coffee networking break is starting now until 10 o'clock.